My name is Jeff Hancock. I'm a professor at Stanford University, and I study the psychology of social media mostly, how people interact with other people online, how they interact with machines, and basically how people behave with technology. Yeah, what a great question. I still remember when my friends' moms were telling me they were getting on Facebook, and I was like, wow, okay, it's a real deal. So that was in the 2000s, and I think right up until sort of like Snowden, I think, was when I first started to detect a kind of a turn on tech and concerns about privacy and surveillance, advertising. And then my study, the emotional contagion study, I think had a big sort of push on people being worried about what these companies were capable of doing. I don't think people really had a good idea that they could be manipulated or that there were algorithms involved, all this stuff. And now they do. And since then there's been other scandals, and I think the coverage of Facebook in particular has been really negative. And so, yeah, I think the attitudes towards big tech, but social companies in particular, have gotten pretty negative. And Microsoft just passed the $1 trillion mark, and at the same time gets almost no negative press. And I think part of it is because they're not very social, and they're not, I mean, except for gaming, but they're also not, people don't think of them as like an algorithm data collection kind of place. So yeah, it's been a big change. When I first moved here to Stanford, it was 2015, and I started to notice that I have my Google Scholar alert. So when somebody cites one of my papers, I get an alert. And every day I'd get one and be like, hey, Facebook or social media causes loneliness. And then literally the next day there'd be an alert and be like, hey, Facebook actually reduces loneliness. It's like constant in the academic world where you were seeing multiple kinds. And so I started to get a little bit frustrated that at the individual study level we were seeing so many differences. But at the public discourse level, so in the media, the prevailing narrative is that it's bad for you. And so as somebody that has studied social media for a long time, and I can see how it can be really valuable for people, the prevailing view of it's bad and it's addictive just didn't jive with sort of my understanding of what we were seeing in the research. So I decided to do a big meta-analysis, and if I ever tell you I'm going to do a meta-analysis again, please slap me and tell me not to do it. It's been a giant project with a lot of people helping and working on it, but finally glad to have it done. Sure. So to set it up, it's 12 years. 2006 with the first paper, Patty Valkenburg's paper, where they said we're looking at social media and we're looking at well-being, all the way up until the end of 2018. 226 studies end up in it. And one thing we did that was different than all the other prior analyses, they tended to focus on one kind of indicator of well-being. So you can focus on negative or positive. So there's prior work on depression. There's prior work on social connectedness, right? But there wasn't one that looked at all the main categories of well-being. So in ours, we look at 6, 3 negative that are the most common and typically are done for well-being studies outside of social media too. Depression, anxiety, loneliness. It's on the negative side. And on the positive side, there's eudaimonic, which is like life satisfaction, hedonic, which is emotion, and social well-being, feeling connected, feeling like you belong, social support, these kind of things. So the first thing we can do is convert them so they all line up. So we can take the negative ones and sort of flip them so that higher well-being means better, okay? So if you're low on depression, you flip it, now you're high. So we convert those into one big giant index, which is kind of insane. And then on the other side of the equation is some measure of how much you use social media. And there's 4 main ways that the field has measured it: how frequently you use it, how much time you spend on it, network characteristics, like how many friends you have, and then subjective experience, like you enjoy using Facebook a lot or stuff like that. Okay, so here's the big finding, the big reveal. And to set it up, a small effect size is 0.2. So Cohen argued that 0.2 is statistically and theoretically meaningful, but practically not. And so ours is 0.01 with a confidence interval of minus 0.02 to positive 0.04. In other words, we have a very precise estimate, and it is 0, right? So we have checked this many times. It's pretty amazing. It's a really tight estimate. As a researcher, it's weird to get excited about a null result in a way. But what it says is that overall, when you look across all kinds of well-being forms, there isn't much of an effect. That's not the whole story. So when we break it apart and we look at those individual kinds of well-being, we see a very small increase, but significant in depression and in loneliness. So more use, you see more depression and loneliness. These are small effects. We detect them though. We have a huge sample. Our overall sample is over 200,000 people. But they're there. It's definitely a real effect. So that's there. And then on the positive side, you get a very small eudaimonic effect, about 0.05, about half the size of the other two, but then a quite large, relatively speaking, of 0.19 for social well-being. So what does that mean? Overall, if you're using it more, you can get a small increase in depression and loneliness. Or sorry, not loneliness, apologize. A small increase in depression and anxiety. There's no effect on loneliness. So bad. And then on the positive side, it's sort of balanced out by a little tiny bit of life satisfaction improvement and a relatively larger social well-being. And when you put those together, they kind of like cancel each other out in a way. So we've been thinking of it as like a trade-off. So you use it and it can increase a little bit depression, anxiety, a little small amount, and it can also make you feel a little bit more connected. And you know, I think intuitively it kind of makes sense, right? Like if I talk to a lot of people, I could get a little bit more anxious too, but I also feel more connected. The overall big story though too is like these effects are really small, right? And it's fitting with some work that just came out of Facebook and their core research team, finding that only about 3% of the 20,000 people they sampled had sort of symptoms of like addiction or problematic Facebook use. Which suggests that, you know, in our meta-analysis, we're looking at a general population, and that for most people, I think most of the time, the effects aren't that big. There's probably a small number of people for which it is actually a big issue. Right. I mean, we as scientists have been really bad at conveying effect size. You know, we talk mostly about what's significant or not, and I think the public tends to get that in a way. There's an effect or not, and we don't talk about effect sizes. People have a hard time. Even I, like when I'm trying to explain it to people, trying to think of like what's a comparable effect size. So I think that's been the big issue is you can get significant results, especially if you're using like large survey data sets, right? Like there's just a lot of correlations to be had, and we now know in psych that that's a, you know, very, you know, common and unfortunate way of like just finding these correlations in large surveys. And they can be important and they can be meaningful, but they're different than finding some sort of like serious effect with a real effect size. So I think that's a big difference. We just don't talk very much about effect sizes, and we need to. Huge limitation in our field is the use and reliance on cross-sectional surveys. So simple one-time surveys that ask, hey, how you doing today, Jake? How's your well-being? And then, hey, you know, how much do you use social media? Or more typically the reverse. 80% of the studies in our sample of the 226 are just simple cross-sectional. What we need are more the sort of gold standard longitudinal and experiments. Experiment done by a colleague here, Matt Genskow, published in MBER, did a really nice study showing getting people to, you know, they manipulated people so they either quit Facebook for a while or kept using it at their rate. And they found something very similar to our meta-analysis actually, which was a very small sort of decrease in general anxiety, but also a change in how they were feeling about socially, right? So even though ours is really cross-sectional.
Wait, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It was the opposite for yours. I thought it was increase in anxiety and.
Right, but then they stop using Facebook,
Oh, I see.
right? So that's the cool thing about their study is they like what happens when you stop using it.
I see.
And when I talked to Matt and told him about our meta-analysis, he was like, yeah, it's really consistent. And it's probably the case that like, you know, if you're using it for an hour or two, like, you know, maybe that fourth hour, you could have been doing something that would have marginal better utility for you. But this also harkens back to the TV era. I mean, there was a period of time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s where there was tons of research about how much TV is good or bad for you. The conclusion of all that work, which is going to be my big conclusion, it's the wrong question. Like the amount of time and frequency is just not the right question. And that's the question we've all been asking. And so we need more experiments and longitudinal work. And we need to start rethinking this idea of social media use. It's not about how much time I spent or how often. I could connect with my family or an old friend or a current friend for once and talk to them for 10, 15 minutes online. Or I could like stalk an ex-girlfriend or something once for 15 minutes. Exact same frequency, exact same amount of time, very different psychological experience. So we got to move past that. A colleague here, Byron Reeves, and his group is doing something called screenomics, where they're looking at your actual usage every 5 seconds, taking a screenshot, and we're getting a much more comprehensive view. And time is chopped up into, you know, less than a minute. And here we are asking people like, how much time did you spend? You know, it just makes no sense. I think we could also start doing other kind of things like simulations. So my other colleague at Cornell, Natalie Bazarova, is this Truman platform. So you go in and you're in a social networking site and you're interacting with people, but it's all bot driven. And so what they're doing is creating simulations. So say a kid can see a bullying incident take place and then kind of learn how to react to it in a safe kind of environment. So I think there's lots of exciting new methods coming out. I can honestly say we don't need any more surveys asking, you know, are you addicted and how much do you know, how are you feeling? The one last thing I should say about this is there were longitudinal studies, gold standard, where you can do cross-lag correlations. And that allows you to look at the effect of time one thing on time two and kind of getting rid of like autocorrelation. And there's two questions that we can ask. One is, does using social media lead to a change in well-being at time two? Or does your well-being at time one lead to a change in social media use at time two? So it kind of allows you to get at the direction. Well, what do we find? The only effect is the better you're feeling well-being wise, the less you use social media. So it's actually your well-being in those studies that's driving your social media use, not the other way around. And it's really hard, even for me, to wrap my head around that because I'm a media person. I study technology. Of course, it has an effect, right? That's how I'm oriented. But probably what makes way more sense is life has the effect. And then you're moving through life. You're doing things. So if I'm not feeling well, if I'm feeling depressed or lonely or anxious, maybe I go and use social media more. Or if I'm not feeling connected, maybe I go and use social media more. And so in those gold standard studies, that is the finding we see. Yeah, so we looked at populations and there's just not enough research on adolescents. And so, you know, I've heard that claim. It makes intuitive sense. Women at that age are developing, they're very sort of like identity conscious. And so like it's intuitive, but I don't see the research out there. Like not enough to make strong claims that that's the population we need to focus on relative to others. So, you know, if there's a study or two out there, that's great. I think that's important and we should know that. But the field of evidence does not tell us that those people are at, you know, particular risk relative to others. I think older people, and again, there's not enough research on them, but we get some sense that, you know, they derive a lot of benefit from it, right? As they start to lose social support, this is a way of reaching out. So yeah, I think tons more research needs to be done, but I think we need to be cautious about making pretty strong claims about specific populations. Yeah, so I have an amazing honor student named Angela Lee, who's actually going to be starting as a PhD, and she just wrote an award-winning thesis looking at mindsets of social media use, and I think it's going to be very similar to phone use. And for those not familiar with mindset, basic idea is like it's a core set of beliefs about how you think something works, and these mindsets are very powerful. They can affect your attention, they can affect your memory, they change your sort of behavior. The most famous example is Carol Dweck over in psychology, growth versus fixed mindsets for intelligence. So people that feel like they have a fixed mindset or a fixed mindset of intelligence, whatever you got, that's what you got. And so if you're being told you're smart, then you'll avoid, anything that'll maybe make it that you're not. And if you encounter failure, there's not much you can do. So it's not a good mindset for improving for education. The growth mindset though it means that you can try, you can grow your intelligence, you can get, smarter. So Angela did the same thing and looked at it in social media. And we followed sort of the work from the mindset field, and you follow this sort of set of things, developed a scale, tested it. Here's what we find. All right, here's what Angela finds is, there's sort of two dimensions of social media use that people think about. Your control over the device. Does it control you? Do you control it? And then this sort of like valence. Do you think it's overall good or bad? Let's set that one aside because I think good or bad kind of comes out of the other one actually. And here, what Angela and I have been talking about now is that what are the endpoints of this kind of control dimension? I think at one end, we've been talking about is an addiction mindset. Right? This is people that believe that like you use it, the phone controls you, and it's bad for you. That's what addiction is, right? On the other end is something like a tool mindset, where you're using this thing and you're trying to accomplish your goals, whether they're distraction or fun or work or social connection or using a map to get from one place to the other. And it's functional. You're trying to do stuff, and you may make mistakes, and you may use it more than you want sometimes. But you ultimately are using this thing. Now, if you think about it from a mindset point of view, the addiction mindset is really bad, actually. Here's your options. I have an addiction mindset. My belief is if I use my phone, I can't help it, and it's bad for me. I have two options. Abstain, right, and feel good, because that's the deal, or use it and feel bad and guilty about myself. Right? So it's a bad mindset, I think. Or a tool mindset, right? You give people this sort of agency over it. You train them like, look, this is your thing, and you make the choices. And I think what we're doing next is an intervention to see if we can move people on that. Now, all that said, yeah, these companies are using psychology to create, apps and systems that are really sticky, and people want to use them. I found myself reaching for a phone, but why addiction? Like, I just think it does nothing good for us. If you're a policymaker, addiction's not going to be the thing to teach kids. Oh yeah, you use your phone, you're a bad person. Like, is that where we feel? So yeah, if you want to say to companies, hey, you need to like be more transparent about your designs, or you need to think about your users' well-being, I'm all for that, 100%. But when we're teaching our kids this idea of addiction, how can that be good for people? And so no, I'm very much not okay with the addiction framing. I do think that there's a small subset of the population for which some of the time it's a real problem. And those people need real help, right? And that's just like saying, like with alcohol, for example, or gambling. Like, yeah, some people definitely should like be really careful about gambling and they need help and support. But for most people, they gamble a little bit, they go back to their real life, there's no issue. So I think addiction is a really problematic framing, not just because it's probably inaccurate for most people most of the time, but it sets up a mindset that is actually unhealthy for people. Yeah. No, so I completely agree. I completely agree. So what do you do there? I think the two things I just said. One, there has to be, at the minimum, sort of like guidelines for tech companies and their development of these platforms, to the other dimension, which is regulation, right? For what kinds of techniques they can use. There's a lot of these and a lot of discussion around dark patterns right now. And I think that's been really useful, is like, hey, designers, like, some of this stuff's not cool, and if your company or your platform or your app uses it, we're going to stop using you, kind of thing, right? Like, I completely agree with that. But telling the general public that they're addicted or that you get addicted to your phone, it just is no good for anybody. Like, you know, I have an 8-year-old, and she, if, you know, she uses her iPad to watch YouTube videos, and she could do that like a lot. And that is a source of friction within our family. So that's where I think we need to talk to them about building digital resilience, not like, you're addicted, right? It just, what does that get her other than feeling bad and guilty? And she gives all of her agency and all of her self-will over to the device. The device gets all the power, and I just think that's wrong. Yeah, and that's right. Like, I want to recognize that this is a very powerful tool. It is a very attractive tool. We know this. Like, you know, anybody walks by a TV, like, our brain is attracted to media. And a lot of things on our phone, this is the other thing, when we're looking at people, we just see the phone. But I could be doing my banking. I could be doing work. I could be playing a video game. I could be reading Moby Dick. I could be chatting with a loved one. I could be having an affair. I mean, it's just, everything is on there. And yet all we see is the back of the phone. And so I think we make these attributions. So we're doing another study just starting, and my colleague here, Sunny Liu, had this really great insight, which is actually, when you're using your phone, your well-being is totally good. You're like accomplishing goals, you're doing whatever you want to do. But if I pulled out my phone and started doing that, and I started ignoring you, my well-being good, your well-being bad. You're feeling excluded. So her insight was like, well, what happens there? Well, then, why is this addiction framework out, or framing, so powerful? I think it's, and this is Sunny's idea, is you're feeling hurt and excluded. So you need to make an attribution for why you're in that situation, right? So you can make an attribution to Jeff. Jeff is ignoring me. That hurts. Or our relationship is not good. That hurts. That's it. Those are hurtful attributions. Or that goddamn phone is making Jeff do this because it's addictive. And that's a much better feeling for the attribution, right? That hurt makes sense now. It's not about Jeff, and it's not about our relationship. It's about this stupid technology. So we're just starting a series of experiments on that now. But I think that's a really good insight. So the way I like to think about it, instead of addictive framing, I like a functional framing, okay? So we often forget, people are trying to accomplish stuff in their day-to-day lives. And not like accomplish, like I want to climb Mount Everest, but like I want to hang out with friends. I want to distract myself. I'm bored. I want to get some work done. I want to, watch a game. I want to see sport, right? We're doing stuff. And the functional approach is that this tool allows me to do stuff, okay? Now, when that tool is causing a problem rather than supporting my goals, that's when people need to work on it. And when I work with a group here called My Digital Tattoo, and I do a ride along with them where they go to schools and they talk to kids, and they're really good about listening and getting kids to talk about what issues they see. It's amazing. They'll often talk about how they were doing something, and they were following somebody on Instagram, and they realized like they were getting kind of obsessed and they needed to dial it back. And it's like, yeah, we make mistakes. Like, why do we beat ourselves up so much when it comes to the phone? Well, maybe one reason is you can make big mistakes, right? You can, we know the bullying thing is a real problem, or you can really screw up work, or you can really screw up a relationship if you're ignoring somebody. But we make mistakes. A toddler, when he or she is learning to walk, will take about 14,000 steps in a day and will fall like flat out 100 times. And that is how that little kid's gonna learn to walk, right? Not by never making mistakes. And here we are in Silicon Valley. This is like the mantra, right? You gotta make mistakes. So we're gonna make mistakes. We will. This is a powerful tool, and it's a new tool, and it's always changing. So we're gonna make mistakes. We gotta help people to understand when they're making a mistake, that they're doing something that's not fitting within their life and their goals, or their family's goals. And we need to have conversations about that. I think we could see more work on apps and tech to actually help people accomplish those goals. But I think that's what it's much more about, is like, yeah, we're going to make mistakes. It's okay. We know that happens. And instead of saying, well, you're addicted and you're a loser and this thing's got total control over you, let's talk about how we can change this. I feel bad. Our relationship, you're on your phone too much when I'd rather have more intimate time with you, right? Like, that's, to me, a much more adaptive way of doing this than the addiction framing one. Right. So very briefly, emotional contagion is this idea that like my emotions can spread to other people without me necessarily conveying them verbally, without you necessarily knowing what my emotions are. And there's been a lot of work showing that it takes place, and that most of the arguments were around physical things, like either I could see you or I could sense it through something. It could be even smell. And our work was the first to sort of examine this in a text-based space, and we showed that in experiments in my lab at Cornell that you could have emotional contagion via text. And then my colleague and friend Adam Kramer was interested in looking at emotion in networks at scale. And they were worried about that at the time because there were some early studies coming out saying, hey, Facebook's newsfeed is all like optimized self-presentation. So you go on, you look at everybody else's perfect life, and you feel bad via social comparison. And I think social comparison is a real thing. I do think that it's overblown. Like, I don't think people are constantly feeling like, envy when they go online. But that was a real concern because for Facebook, it's like, wow, if our like main product is actually depressing people, we need to know about that. So that's their motivation. And I'd been doing this in the lab with small groups of people, dyads. So Facebook was doing this study, and Adam asked if I wanted to be involved and help out, and I did. So that's how the study came to be. And when we went through the results, we found that opposite what you'd predict for social comparison, when Facebook sort of demoted, say, negative emotion posts in your feed. So let's say your feed, there's 1,500 pieces of content that Facebook could show you in your news feed. And most people will look at 15 to 20. So Facebook's having to like figure out what those top, say, 30 are. And they would demote them if you were in the negative emotion condition. They would demote sort of sad posts with sad information. And if you were in the positive emotion one, then they would demote things that were positive. So they never went away or anything like that, and they weren't directed at you. They were just put down in the algorithmic curated feed. And what we found were super tiny effects that were so tiny that the only way we were able to detect them was the massive sort of scale of the study. But the effects were consistent with an emotional contagion story. That is, when you were seeing more, or you were seeing less sad stuff, your writing when you posted was less sad and more positive. And when you saw less happy, your posts had less happy and more sad in them. Whereas, so it's kind of it's actually a nice finding in a way. It's like, oh yeah, if you see your friends are happy and you are more happy. And that goes against the social comparison, which would have been that if you saw less sad stuff, then you'd be feeling happier, right? So again, I think social comparison happens. I think it's much more local. It's very temporary. But when you look overall across everything, then there's more emotional contagion, but it's very, very, very slight. I mean, these are posts that aren't even messages to you. They're just somebody saying something to the world, and the algorithm shows it to you. So it's kind of astonishing we're able to detect that anyways. But that's the science of the study. Yeah, I do. I think it is contagion. I think there's multiple mechanisms for why in-civil discourse travels as much as it does. One of them is a contagion thing, and it's a real problem, But we've also seen evidence of when people are kind, it also can be contagious. But unfortunately for humans, negative is more attention-getting. And so, if you talk to a news editor, they have a saying, which is if it bleeds, it leads, right? Because that's what people are interested in attending to, and there's good evolutionary reasons for that. So I think that's the central challenge. It can be so horrible on there, I think contagion's one piece. I think there's a psychological component too around not getting feedback. So not, you know, if I were to say something horrible to your face, I would see your reaction and everything. And when I do that online, I tend to get less feedback about that. There's sort of a de-individuation effect too, where, well, not de-individuation, it's more like I don't see you as a complete person. I see you as like a liberal, or I see you as a conservative, and then that's everything about you, and I blow that up. And that's another issue. We get these sort of thin slices of each other in social media. And if we don't know people, we take the little piece that we know about them and blow that up. And so that's, you know, Joe Walder has sort of been showing this hyper-personal effect for a long time, and consistent with all the psych theory. And I think those pieces of it help us figure out that puzzle, which is you can say negative things without encountering feedback. I focus on one aspect of the person. If it's different for me, then they're an out group. I'm more likely to be mean. And when I am mean, all that socialization of like how it feels bad to see somebody else hurting, that's just shut off. So, you know, kids are like little psychopaths when they're first, you know, play school in kindergarten, and a lot of socialization is about like not being a psychopath and like feeling how somebody else feels when you do something to them. And so I think those are some of the key pieces of the puzzle. I think that's probably right. I agree with Amy's assessment there. I think it fits with the attribution thing that we were talking about earlier. And Dana Boyd and I were talking, and Dana had this lovely point that I repeat all the time. So we have a lot of social ills. One of the main ones is like income inequality, which, as we know from lots of research, creates a lot of anxiety, and it stretches the social fabric of a society. I think polarization is a part of this. Polarization goes back into the 93 or 4, according to Matt Genskow's work looking at Congress. So it's an old phenomenon, and we have this income inequality that's just getting stretched. We have global warming. We have young people facing higher student debt levels than ever imaginable. We have a changing society in terms of like the workforce, right? Tons of anxiety. Okay, those things are all big and important, and they're invisible, right? But then there's this goddamn phone, and I can see it, and I can point at it, and you're using it, right? And so this was Dana's point, is like this thing is visible and concrete. And if I'm a parent and I see my kids like really anxious, could it be that like, you know, income inequality in our neighborhood is skyrocketing? Could it be global climate change? Could it be that she's like, oh my God, like I'm gonna graduate with $100,000 in debt. Like this is impossible. No, those are all invisible. It's that thing right there. So
it's also new, and it's
right. Yeah. And we don't know, like when there's change, we don't know. And until our meta-analysis, you know, you could have thought like, yeah, it's really bad for me because there's all these studies lining up and showing me how bad it is. Yeah, no, I think it's exactly the right question. It's a big ask, but I have an idea now. So I felt really bad in 2016 when the whole fake news thing blew up, and I was like, oh my God, how did I miss this, right? A guy that studies deception and technology, and I honestly didn't see it. Even though we knew about the IRA, I was teaching about the Russian stuff in my class, but I never grokked it. I never put it together with elections. So I spent a sabbatical just wondering, how did I miss this? So two things I kind of learned. The first is we may have like overblown that moral panic. So 3 really nice studies have come out in 2019 showing that there was fake news, but it was highly targeted. It was targeted at old people, people over 65. It was highly manipulative, and it was aimed at them, particularly older and conservative people. And that most of the news, the fake news, was shared by older people with older people, right? So they were totally targeted and manipulated. But I bet you if you were to look in your feed and I were to look in mine, we would have a really hard time finding any fake news. So it's not to say that there isn't any fake news, but I think it was highly targeted at a certain part of our population that was manipulated and perhaps don't have some of the digital literacy skills that younger people have. If you were over 65, you were 7 times more likely to share fake news than someone in their 20s, right? Now, it takes academics a while to do good work, right? So that's why it's coming out. It's 2016, but the research gets published in 2019. So that's not to say that I can exonerate myself for missing it. I think there was another piece to it. And the second thing that I got out of my sabbatical and thinking about this was, in social media, there are really two worlds, but we only talk about one. So the two worlds are what I call the known and the unknown world. Known world is like people like Jake, who I know and I expect to see again, my family, my colleagues, my coworkers. It could be a date, like I maybe haven't met them, but I hope to. It could be somebody I'm doing a sale with, so I don't know them. It could be somebody I play hockey with. But I know them, or I know I'm going to know them, or I hope to know them. Okay. Then there's this other world over here, which is that Russian dude. It's the guy from Nigeria with all the money. It's advertisers, it's news from places I don't recognize. And those two worlds, which in our physical world are super easily separated, right? Like, I know you, and I'm going to trust what you have to say, no problem. But in the social media world, they're right on top of each other. And especially if you don't have a ton of digital literacy, which is just, in my view, like experience with this overlapping two worlds, really difficult to tell what is what and who to believe. So you're getting like weird stories from what turned out to be Russians trying to, goose the fires of polarization right alongside baby pictures from your niece. And so that's a really difficult situation. And so I think that was another thing is we talk about social media and the information world and fake news as like one thing, but it's very much two. So I think some of the moves that Facebook has made around centering it again around your kind of like local network and physical world relationships, I think that's exactly right. I think reducing the kind of like the way that the unknown can get access to you is exactly right. And unfortunately, we have this advertising business model, which maybe is the root of most of our problems, not all. I don't know how they're going to deal with that, where, like advertises that's the route where the unknown world can come right to your doorstep all the time in a very targeted sort of way. So that's where I'm feeling about fake news right now. But if we get some more training and literacy into the people specifically that are being targeted by these bad actors, and we start to disambiguate those two worlds. And I think young people are actually really good at that. They have lots of practice. And, my age and up, I think we still struggle with that. Yeah. And I think especially in countries with less resources and less of a media infrastructure. So here in the U.S., like things will get debunked, and then you get to choose if you're gonna like continue to believe this thing that's emotionally exciting to you or not. But at least you have some awareness of this. But you're right. I think in other places it won't. So I don't have a lot of panic about this because we've seen fakery in all kinds of ways, and we sort of like adapt and evolve. Humans aren't dumb. We have this presentism bias where we think that like the way things are now is the way they'll always be, and like I can trust video. Well, there's lots of times when people have questioned video and do we really think that? And we adjust, and it's going to be also about source and like trusting where you're getting stuff from. So I'm net positive on this, but I think it will be very disruptive in the short term. And it could have this generalized trust problem, which is a whole separate thing, whether you believe that particular deep fake or not. But if you start to pull back and start to not believe the media and news and reporters, then we're in a dangerous territory. It's complicated, and I hate as an academic saying that, but we have evidence of when people have more time as doing both. So Catalina Toma did this really nice study where we gave people time to create an online dating profile, or we made them do it right away. So it was like they could do it overnight or they had to do it right away. And then they rated how honest they felt their things were. And the ones that had more time said they were more honest. Because I think, part of it is time allows us to compose things in ways that we think are more accurate. Whereas when we're forced to say things quickly, that's when lies often happen. That said, if you have a motivation to lie, so you need to lie, like you've done something wrong, you're worried about punishment, you want to save somebody else's feelings, then that asynchrony provides you with, an affordance. I can actually craft it better and makes it a little bit less emotional. So it does both things. If you're given time to do something, more time will allow you to do it more honestly and accurately. If you need to accomplish some goal and your main way of doing that is going to be deception, then more time will help you with that deception. So folk theory is our sort of like unscientific understanding of the way the world works and things in the world. So the one example I like to use is gravity. We all have a folk theory about gravity. And I feel my folk theory is pretty darn good. Like, it's got me through life. So it's not an insult to say folk theory. It's just that I don't scientifically study gravity. And that became clear when my daughter, when she was about 6, asked me how gravity worked. And I was very excited to tell her. And she's like, okay, so how does it work? And I'm like, well, when really big things are, they have this mass, and that creates a force that attracts smaller things towards them. And she's like, oh, okay, great. Why? And right then I knew I was in trouble. So like 3 Ys down, I'm like, I have no idea how gravity works. And it turns out I truly don't know. And most of us don't know anything about the gravitational coefficient or how it works with time and space. And even physicists, will talk about the complexities of gravity. Right? So I have a folk theory of gravity. It allows me to get through my world. I have a folk theory of people. So my theory of mind is like a folk theory. So even though I'm not a neuroscientist, I have a good idea that if I were to come over and slap you, how you might react, right? I can guess how you would look shocked and questioning and maybe punch me back or something, all without knowing really how exactly the brain works. So we also have folk theories about technical systems too. Everything from toilets to helicopters to technology. So the helicopters and toilets have been worked out. We all have folk theories about them. Most people don't really know how those systems work. Well, something like the Facebook news feed is a massively complex system. It has over 1 billion social inputs a day. It has some of the world's most advanced machine learning taking place. So it's constantly changing and adapting, and it has people really tightly integrated with tech. And so people have folk theories of those. And the reason I started thinking about folk theories was because of the emotional contagion study. Part of me was like, when I looked through my hate mail, all the many, many emails I received, one of the main themes that came out was like, how dare you manipulate my newsfeed? And as I was listening to it to try and get a better understanding of what happened, that was a clear thing. It was people really had no idea that there was any manipulation going on at all. And it was clear that like, if your folk theory was that Facebook was like a platform, which was how they branded themselves for a long time, or a social window into your life, well, windows and platforms don't manipulate people and conduct experiments, right? And the notion of an algorithm, right? There's no idea of that in 2014. So we started to look into this folk theory thing, and folk theories are really fascinating and really difficult to study because they're unstated. So cognitive scientists have done some really nice work with kids, developmental psychologists, anthropologists. And so we used metaphors to try and get to them, and we would ask people like what their metaphor for, say, the news feed was. And we used a new tool called Wiki Survey, which is super cool because you get to ask a question and people choose like, is news feed like a butler or like a spy? And they can pick one of those. Or they can say, well, neither of those really work for me, and then they can create their own, and it gets entered into the survey and it has to fight it out with all the others. So it was really cool. We seeded this wiki survey with about 10 of our metaphors. In the end, the 10 winning metaphors, only 2 of ours were in it, and the 8 others were from users. And that's why that tool is so cool. And so we find in general, this is 2015-16, that there were 4 folk theories. They're sort of like a good one where like a butler goes out, it gets stuff for me. It's very useful. It's working for me. A very negative one, it's like a spy or paparazzi. It's taking things from me and the value is for somebody else. There was sort of like a black box, like I have no idea. Some things go in, some things come out, and it's kind of like scares me. And then there was another one, it was like almost like a newspaper or a magazine where somebody is choosing stuff for me and I get to read content. And relatively neutral, kind of like folk theory. So in 2015, 16, those were the four. We saw them in both Twitter and Facebook, but Facebook had a little bit higher of the more negative ones than Twitter. Twitter had a little bit more of the positive and the neutral. And we're rerunning that now to see, like, after the Cambridge Analytica and the sort of privacy breaches, the late reporting, to see how that's affected folk theories. But that's what we've been doing, and it's been really cool because I talk to business leaders in all kinds of areas, and they're all sort of realizing that these folk theories are really important because you're essentially trust is essentially like you're making a promise, and it might be with a consumer, and you have an idea what your promise is, but if you don't know what their folk theory is of your product or your service, then you don't know what you've promised, and so you can make violations. You can violate that trust without even knowing it, because you had an idea of a promise in mind, but they had a very different idea, and you don't know because you didn't analyze their folk theories. So that's been really interesting, for everything from cars to Alexa and Siri to the news feed, all this kind of stuff. So that was really eye-opening, that you can make these kinds of mistakes, really, like violate expectations without having a good idea. No, and I talked to a lot of people too about the study. I've talked about that study a lot because anytime anybody wanted to talk about it, I said yes, because I wanted to sort of make up for causing a disturbance in the universe. And when you talk to non-scientists, they really did have this feeling of like, well, if a company's doing it to improve their product, that's okay. But if you're doing it for science, then no. And I'm still like blown. I kind of get it. But I'm also like, but isn't the science like the good? Like, we're trying to improve things in general?
I have the exact inverse view.
Right.
That may be my background.
Yeah, I think if we're coming from science, you kind of see what the enterprise is trying to do. But I think if you're not a scientist, it's like like, why? Like, is that for your own personal gain? Is that going to just get you a paper? Like, what is? I don't think you necessarily think about the long-term value of doing science. Yeah, it's a really good question, and it comes back to that functional perspective I talked about before, which is I'm trying to do stuff in the world. I'm not using tech or media just for fun and giggles. Sometimes we do that, but I'm trying to like distract myself or have fun and giggles. So your folk theories are working when they allow you to use the tech to accomplish your goals. And they're not working when they undermine those. So most of the time, let's say you're my mom and she's posting stuff on Facebook and her family and friends are commenting on it, everything is good. Some fake news gets in there and gets her really upset because something bad happened and it's a lie, but that's how they emotionally manipulated folks. And she believes things that are coming in her thing they can be trusted because one of her friends shared it looks like, or a bunch of people liked it, and her folk theory is that, well, if that many people like it, it must be true. That folk theory now is actually undermining her goals of being a well-informed citizen and not being emotionally manipulated. So I think that's the way to think about it, is like you're doing stuff, and if your folk theories are supporting you doing your things, you're golden. So like my folk theory of gravity totally allows me to raise a daughter, make it to the age of 45, play hockey, even though it's way oversimplified and wrong to some degree. Right? So yeah, that's sort of how we think about it. And people update their folk theories all the time. So, people might think like, oh, on Tuesday if you post, you get more viral or whatever, right? And they do it 5-6 times and they see that it's wrong. They'll change it, right? And these are not trivial either, right? Like if you're running a business now, your folk theory of like how Facebook or Instagram works, and you run a bar or some other social thing, like that's crucial to your business. Yeah. So it's not just like trivial and like what I'm talking about for breakfast and whether my folk theory fits that or not. It's like my business depends on Facebook or Instagram traffic.